Hey, if you're a React Native developer, I'm sure the thoughts crossed your mind before how cool it would be to build your own apps end to end. Not just the mobile client, but the back end as well. Personally, I've used Firebase for my backends in the past, but the non-relational database structure just doesn't feel great. So today, I want to tell you about two technologies that I'm super excited about. First, Hasura. Hasura is a serious game changer for devs like me. It allows you to plug in a Postgres database and expose a GraphQL API to your mobile or web client. It takes less than 2 minutes to set up, and it even comes with a simple and intuitive web interface where you can create tables, add and remove columns, and set per column permissions. Hasura is amazing. Okay, the second thing I wanted to tell you about is GraphQL Codegen. If you've been working with GraphQL for a while, you're probably familiar with it, but if not, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an open source CLI that generates types and query functions from your GraphQL schema. With a single command, you can generate networking code that might take you a week to write otherwise. Okay, now that we've set the table, let's dive in and write some code. I'm going to be setting up an Expo project, creating a Hasura API, using GraphQL Codegen to create the networking code that we'll need, and finally, fetching data from our Hasura API. I'll also be using RTK Query here. I'm a big fan of Redux Toolkit, which RTK Query ships with, and I use it in most of my other projects. Oh, and one last thing. There's a link to the source code in the description if you want to check it out. Okay, let's get started. First, let's start a new Expo project with the TypeScript template. Now let's cd into the directory we just created and install the core dependencies we'll be using. We've got Redux Toolkit, GraphQL Request, GraphQL itself, and RTK Query GraphQL Request Base Query, which will help us make GraphQL requests using RTK Query. Now let's start setting up Redux. We're going to want to install React Redux, types for React Redux, and also Redux Thunk. So now let's open up VS Code and create a file called store.ts. First, we're going to want to import create store from Redux Toolkit. We're also going to want to import apply middleware and combined reducers from Redux. We can now create our root reducer, and it'll just be an empty invocation of combined reducers. We'll want a middlewares collection that'll just include Thunk. And now we can export our store by invoking create store and passing in our root reducer and our middlewares. Now in app.tsx, we'll wrap our component in a provider, passing in the store that we just created. Cool, now that we've got Redux set up, let's get started creating our API client. Let's make a new file called api.ts, and in there, let's get started by creating a new GraphQL client, which we'll import from GraphQL request. Now we'll use Redux Toolkit's create API function to create our API, passing in our client to GraphQL base query as the base query. And for now, our endpoints will just be empty. Awesome. So now we're at the point where it's time to set up our backend. So let's open up a web browser and navigate over to hasura.io. We'll log in and create a new project. We're going to call this one RTK Query Hasura Codegen. Awesome, so now we've got our project. We'll head over to the Data tab and tap on Create Heroku Database, which Hasura does automatically for us. Pretty nice. And now we can view our database and create our first table. So let's click on Create Table here. We're going to call it users, and our users are going to have an ID as the primary key and also an email of type text. And now we can click on Add Table, and that's all we need to do. Let's insert some data here so that we have something to populate the database. We'll click on Insert Row, and we'll put in a user with email test@test.com. Click Save. And now if we head over to the API, we can actually query our database using this online GUI. So we can get the first 10 users, and you can see that the database returns some data. And if we click on this checkbox over here, we can add the email property. And there we go. We can see our user with test.test as their email, which is the user that we'd expect to find here. Cool, so now we can get started putting together the code generation infrastructure that we'll need to generate query functions for GraphQL. First, let's install our dependencies. We'll need the GraphQL Codegen CLI, as well as the TypeScript RTK Query plugin, the TypeScript Operations plugin, and the near operation file preset plugin. Now we'll run the GraphQL Codegen setup wizard. We'll select React here, grab our schema from Hasura, pick our plugins, set our desired output path, and we'll want to be able to invoke code generation by typing yarn g in the terminal. So we'll just put g here. So before we get started, we'll actually want to head back to Hasura and grab our API URL to put in our API client, because GraphQL Codegen is going to be using the schema that's located on Hasura. And also importantly, Hasura is going to require an Hasura admin secret header. So we're going to grab that value from Hasura as well and add it to our client. Cool, so now let's head over to codegen.yaml. This file was created by the setup wizard that we just went through. And the first thing that we're going to do is add our Hasura admin secret header so that when we invoke the generation script, it won't get a 400 response from Hasura. And down at the bottom here, we're going to add a few plugins, TypeScript, TypeScript Operations, and TypeScript RTK Query. We're going to tell it where to import the base API from, which is the API file that we created earlier. And we're also going to add the near operation file preset. This tells GraphQL Codegen to generate a new file per operation file. Now, in order for us to use the Codegen CLI, we're going to have at least one query in place. So let's write a get users query. First, let's create a queries directory here and a GraphQL file for our request. And conveniently, we can actually just copy and paste the query that we made in the Hasura web console earlier and put it right into our code base. So let's do that. We'll name our query get users and we'll paste the body right in. And at this point, we're good to go. So we can hop over to the terminal and run yarn g. Great, so now we can see that we've got a GraphQL.ts file and a getUsers.generated.ts file. But it looks like this getUsers.generated.ts file has a lot of extraneous types in here that are actually already present in GraphQL.ts and should just be imported. So something is slightly amiss here. Okay, so after some debugging, it turns out that what we need to do is remove the TypeScript plugin from our source directory here. So we only want to be using TypeScript operations and TypeScript RTK Query for the source directory here. And now we can hop back into the terminal, run yarn g again, and now we can see that our getusers.generated.ts file just includes the queries and it imports its types from GraphQL.ts. Okay, so now we're actually in a position where we can start fetching data from Hasura. But before we do that, let's run the app and just see what things look like. Looks like we're getting an error. So our root reducer is empty. So that's one thing we forgot to do. Let's hop back into store.ts and add our API's reducer to our combined reducers invocation. And now let's see if our app runs. Looks like we've got a new error. Now, if we look closely here, it looks like Metro Bundler isn't able to find this index.cjs file. So what we're going to have to do is add the CJS file extension to Metro Bundler's source extensions. So what we're going to do is create a new file called metro.config.ts and add some code in there such that Metro Bundler knows to bundle files with the CJS file extension. Okay, so let's try to run our app one more time. Awesome, so now we can see that our app is running successfully, and here we can see the placeholder text displayed as we might expect. So now we can actually write our queries. Let's open up app.tsx and create a new component. We're going to call useQuery on our getUsers endpoint and grab data from it by destructuring. And in this text component here, we're just going to display the stringified JSON from our data. We'll add our child component to the view hierarchy, and now we can see our data. And we can see that the payload in our app is the same as the payload that we get from the Hasura console. We've got a user with email test@test.com. Pretty cool. So now we've got the foundations of a full-fledged GraphQL backend running on Hasura. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments, what subjects you might like to see me cover in the future, and I'll see you in another video soon.